Inspiration has always colored From Software games, with Kentaro Miura's Berserk being the prime example, of course, but H.P. Lovecraft is another inspiration that has become inseparable from their games. With Bluepoint's 2020 remake of Demon's Souls, it's become somewhat cyclical. Lovecraft can be seen in much of Demon's Souls. The interpretation of the Old One as a Great One who must be lulled back to slumber, for example, or the tentacle-headed guards and body horror of Tower of Latria. And years later, Lovecraft would inspire Bloodborne as well. When Bluepoint remade Demon's Souls, the architecture of Latria became decidedly more gothic, an inspiration seemingly taken from Bloodborne. With that, Soulsborne games are now being inspired by Soulsborne games. On the topic of Lovecraft's influence, Hidetaka Miyazaki himself has said as much. As he states, his games are inspired by, quote, classical works of gothic horror, Lovecraft's Cthulhu mythos, plus a few board games and TRPGs based on such themes. This isn't the first game of mine to draw on these roots, as most of my ideas are actually text-inspired. But what about the characteristics of Lovecraft's works that are better left behind? It is not impossible to discuss H.P. Lovecraft's texts without discussing race. The genre of cosmic horror has survived its author. But for many, the racist undertones of Lovecraft's works are hard to remedy. Cosmic horror itself plays on the fear of the other, the unfamiliar, the alien, the foreign. And of course, some of Lovecraft's works are inseparable from race, depicting the other in ways that feel too close to home. In Bloodborne's sympathetic depiction of the other, the Great Ones and their kin, the beasts plaguing Old Yarnum, and the player character themselves, Hidetaka Miyazaki evades the racism associated with the source material while preserving a love for the genre of cosmic horror. All the characteristics of cosmic horror that people remember fondly are in Bloodborne. Eccentric characters, bizarre cults, the Great Ones and their dreams. But cosmic horror is not complete without the other. For the sake of this video, I will be examining 3 instances of the other in Bloodborne, each depicted in a sympathetic light. This sympathy is exemplified by the residents of the fishing hamlet, and, most interestingly, in the Great Ones themselves. The healing church is built on blood, both the blood administered to patients in blood healing, and the blood of the fishing hamlet. Learning that the carcass of Kos washed up on the coast, the hunters of the healing church traveled to the fishing hamlet, massacring its people and defiling the carcass of Kos. This massacre is presented as a horrific event, and, as revealed by the underground cell key, the healing church is actively trying to cover it up. Hunters are held within the underground cell, so that things better left unseen, better left unknown, will decay quietly in the fallow darkness. Moreover, the hunters of the healing church are condemned as blasphemous murderers and blood-crazed fiends for their role in the massacre. Even for the hunters themselves, the massacre of the fishing hamlet is more than a lingering regret, but something that churns their stomachs. Rakuyo, a weapon used by Lady Maria in the massacre, reveals as much. One day, she abandoned her beloved Rakuyo, casting it into a dark well when she could stomach it no longer. This is where Bloodborne separates itself from H.P. Lovecraft. Unlike the residents of the fishing hamlet, the residents of Innsmouth are depicted as villains more than they are victims. And, admittedly, in the context of Lovecraft's story, they are villains. To the narrator of The Shadow over Innsmouth, however, his contempt for the residents of Innsmouth at first stems from their physical appearance and reputation. The narrator disparagingly refers to their appearance as the, quote, Innsmouth look. They seemed sullenly banded together in some sort of fellowship and understanding, despising the world as if they had access to other and preferable spheres of entity. Their appearance, especially those staring, unwinking eyes which one never saw shut, was certainly shocking enough, and their voices were disgusting. It was awful to hear them chanting in their churches at night, and especially during their main festivals or revivals, which fell twice a year on April 30th and October 31st. It isn't just the appearance of Innsmouth residents that disgusts the narrator, but their festivals, their culture, their very existence. This section from The Shadow over Innsmouth applies just as much to the residents of the fishing hamlet, but it changes nothing in the context of Bloodborne's story. The massacre at the fishing hamlet, regardless of the foreign appearance and culture of its people, was a horrific event, and it is presented as such. Given how sympathetic the residents of the fishing hamlet are meant to be, it's a pretty neat subversion of the residents of Innsmouth. And considering Kos, a great one, is portrayed just as sympathetically, it's a pretty neat subversion of Lovecraft altogether. As Lady Maria says, a corpse should be left well alone. This line takes on a double meaning, applying just as much to Kos as it does to Maria. That's the most interesting part about most Great Ones in Bloodborne. They're just as ancient and alien as Lovecraft's, but their motives are distinctly human, or at the very least familiar. They want to bear children. Kos is just a mother. Each piece of the umbilical cord, items needed to unlock one of Bloodborne's endings, has a unique section that relates to where it is found, but each begins with the same line. Every Great One loses its child, and then yearns for a surrogate. It doesn't change that they pursue this motivation in horrifically alien ways, but it makes you look at Bloodborne's horrors in a different light, and forces you to question what you're actually doing as you play the game. As Hidetaka Miyazaki states, this is by design. Quote, "I like trying to focus on the fun of exploring this really dark place, than attempting to shine a light upon it." The beasts of Old Yarnum force you to think further. Although dangerous, they are isolated from others, and are of no harm to those who stay out of their territory. Question is, what do you do about this? This situation is actually depicted in several From Software games, with the other always shown in a sympathetic light, despite being different and dangerous. In Demon's Souls, for example, the people of the Valley of Defilement are hostile, but only to those who approach their territory. As lamented by Enki in Dark Souls, the people of Blighttown, also hostile, are afflicted by disease and shut off from the outside world.
Worse than undead, we are diseased and unwanted.
In Dark Souls 2, the people of the gutter are similarly unwanted, thrown into the pit in Majula to be forgotten. In each instance, there is a distinct other separate from the player and isolated from society, but they are always depicted sympathetically. And of course, I imagine H.P. Lovecraft's depictions of these same situations would be far different. Perhaps there would be a revenge plot in the vein of Herbert West Reanimator, where the people of the gutter begin leaking into the surface. But no, they remain isolated. The gutter is their home. Jura, a retired hunter who watches over the beasts isolated in Old Yarnum, now their home, argues on their behalf.
There's nothing more horrific than a hunt. In case you fail to realize, the things you hunt, they're not beasts. They're people.
The Charred Hunter set, a piece of clothing, also explicitly refers to the beasts of Old Yarnum as victims. Wearers of this attire hunted down victims of the Scourge, who survived the raging flames and stench of singed blood. Jura's dialogue also applies to the people of the fishing hamlet, who were massacred by the Healing Church hunters to get to the carcass of Kos. And again, the other, dangerous and foreign, is depicted in a sympathetic light. This scenario even mirrors the player's own. You must go through Old Yarnum to progress through the game. In each instance, there is a clear distinction between the conqueror and the conquered. Yet that isn't to oversimplify the player character's role in the story. You can choose to spare the remaining beasts in Old Yarnum. Interestingly, the player character occupies a much different role in Bloodborne. You are one of the other. Nothing is more explicit than the player character's role as a foreigner in Yarnum. When you begin the game, you are wearing the foreigner's garb. When traveling through Yarnum, the player character is labeled an outsider. In a sense, this acts as a reversal of the Shadow over Innsmouth. You are treated as the narrator treats the residents of Innsmouth, despite occupying a role most similar to his.
Lads, you've come on. You'd open the door on a night of a hunt. Away with you, now!
Are you that outsider? Well, sorry, but I don't want anything to do with you. Trot along, will ya?
For the Yarnumites transforming into beasts, their xenophobia is far more apparent. Immediately hostile, they fling insults and blame the player character for the scourge plaguing Yarnum.
Away! Away! You vagrant rat! You fiend! You are not wanted here! It's all your fault! I'll mess up your brain! You better have dead!
Xenophobia is thematic to Bloodborne. Cosmic horror plays on a fear of the other, and to the residents of Yharnam, you are the other. Xenophobia as a theme was first brought to my attention by Redgrave, who notes that this theme was likely far more apparent for Bloodborne's Japanese audience. Of course, it's not my place to definitively say that Bloodborne is responding directly to xenophobia in Japan. What I can say is that xenophobia is a major theme in Bloodborne, and in Japan, where xenophobia is prevalent, this theme would be far more apparent. As such, the fact that your character is a foreigner is an important distinction, especially in separating Bloodborne from H.P. Lovecraft. And when one of the primary influences of Bloodborne comes from an openly xenophobic author, separating itself from the characteristics of his work that are better left behind would have made sense. But Bloodborne doesn't forget its history, and instead presents these characteristics in a way that subverts them. In Bloodborne, the other is distinctly familiar, not so different from ourselves.